The Dreamcast was a console whose ethos firmly looked to the future. The whole philosophy of the machine was to take the industry into new and exciting realms. Some of them were online, others were on fishing boats. It promised everything and more. And whilst there were many contributing factors to the console's downfall, its death was not in vain. When the Dreamcast fell by the wayside, the blueprints for the entire future of the industry were left in its wake. I'm Si for WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 ways the Sega Dreamcast was ahead of its time. Number 10, incredibly detailed open worlds. Whatever Shenmue's objective quality, no one can argue it wasn't revolutionary. Yu Suzuki dubbed his baby the first free FREE title, which in case you're wondering stands for Fully Reactive Eyes Entertainment, and yes, that sounds like nonsense because it is nonsense. But Shenmue's suburban sprawl, Yokosuka, was the most meticulously realised environment ever seen. Details were painstakingly precise, every building was accessible, every shop was fully stocked, and every location felt tangibly real. But it was an oxymoron. Through being fascinatingly authentic, it also managed to be acutely boring. It was a sandbox without much sand. Sega made little return on their $45 million investment, and whilst it crippled the company, the industry profited. A world as intricately realised as Shenmue's seemed light years away before Suzuki showed it was a possibility. Further still, its narrative-heavy, action-like nature paved the way for a whole new breed of engrossing interactive fiction. Oh, and QuickTime events, it gave us those as well. Well, you know what they say, you can't make an omelette without spilling a few eggs all over the industry for the next 15 years. Yeah. Number 9, console linking portable devices. Remember when you used to buy a new memory card for your PlayStation and think, I wish this was also a Tamagotchi? No? Well, Sega did. A simple interchangeable slab of raw disk space wasn't enough for the Japanese company, and with a capricious misregard for established industry standards, Sega unveiled the Visual Memory Unit. Was it a memory card? Was it a games device? Was it a needless way to justify its exorbitant price? It was all of these things and more. Thanks to its Diddy LCD display, the VMU often doubled up as an in-game aid, from displaying the usually hidden health monitor in Resident Evil to signalling the presence of a nearby charm in Skies of Arcadia. The VMU's capabilities didn't stop there. Some games, notably Sonic Adventure, provided mini-games which could be saved to the memory unit and then played on the go. It was truly space-age stuff. Of course, many of these portable playthings were utter rubbish, but Sega were forging into a brave new world. Such connectivity between consoles and other devices had never been seen before on such a system-wide scale. However, like the console's pioneering ideas, widespread connectivity failed because the technology just wasn't ready for it, and a whole generation of chows were left to expire in the drawers of Dreamcast owners. Sorry, little fella. Number 8, PAL 60 resolutions. Before the Dreamcast, the difference between the North American and Japanese NTSC television standard and Europe's PAL format meant that whilst European broadcasts could display in a higher quality, they ran at a lower frame rate to compensate. This seemed a fair trade-off as far as television was concerned, but for gamers it was a different story. American and Japanese games converted for use on PAL systems rarely took advantage of the additional pixel real estate, often processing power simply didn't allow it, and as a result European gamers were stuck with titles that were both slower than their foreign counterparts and blighted by thick black borders on the frontiers of the screen. Europeans wondered what all the fuss was about Sonic the Hedgehog. Yeah, it was fast, but it wasn't that fast. The irony of that example, of course, is that Sega redressed the balance, the Dreamcast becoming the first console to allow blighted PAL players to finally experience games in the same way as their NTSC cousins. By giving European gamers a 60Hz mode, the Dreamcast finally allowed the blue blaze to zip across their screens at his intended velocity. Number 7, full analog triggers. Whether you personally love or hate the Dreamcast controller, you have to admit it's not exactly a bastion of ergonomic excellence. Its circular shape makes one feel as though they're driving a bus, whilst the analog stick is as slippery as a greasy toad on a banana skin, and the wire coming out the bottom, all the gods wept. So how exactly is the Dreamcast's much maligned pad ahead of its time? Well, the answer comes in the form of 2 triggers hidden on its inverse. Few things feel as satisfying as depressing the spongy buttons to their limit. Tactile titillation aside, the triggers, being fully analog, revolutionised the way some of the industry's most enduring genres were controlled. Acceleration in driving sims was shifted from face buttons to a perfectly precise throttle on the prong's underside. Shooting enemies now felt all the more realistic and therefore all the more fun. In-game cameras were given the perfect dolly. Admittedly, the controller wasn't the first to feature trigger buttons of this ilk. The design was largely based on Sega's own 3D pad released alongside Knight's 3 years earlier. However, the Dreamcast made them standard, and 3 years later the Xbox's clone controller made them universal. Number 6. GDROMs. After surveying the piracy rampant on Sony's PlayStation console, Sega knew they needed a better solution than a basic CD-ROM. Their answer was a proprietary format, the GDROM. And no matter how badly you want it, it doesn't stand for goddamn ROM. I wish. Although that being said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Whilst would-be copiers were foiled by the patent format, Sega neglected to consider that pirates could simply pack most of the console's games onto a standard CD anyway. Not only did the GD-ROM fail in its sole purpose of combating bootleggers, it also caused a swath of laser failures, not to mention the Dreamcast's distinctive raspy loading noise. Sony's decision to go with DVDs for the PS2 was disastrous for the Dreamcast. Not only did the format offer 8 times the capacity, it also transformed the rival machine into a budget DVD player. GD-ROMs were an unmitigated failure, but ahead of its time doesn't always equate to good. Sega were the first company to combat the issue of piracy head-on, without resorting to a prohibitive cartridge format, and theirs was a move that would later be imitated by Nintendo for the GameCube. Sega had to take the greatest hit of all to teach the rest of the industry how to fight piracy. As Plato said, and he was clearly talking about the Dreamcast, only the dead see the end of the war. Number 5. The idea of a console dashboard. Gamers used to have a relatively simple life. Stick the cartridge in the slot, press the power button, and away you go. Instant gaming gratification. Before CD-based consoles, starting your machine up sans cartridge would produce nothing more than a black screen. Consoles had just one function, to play games and nothing more. Despite the PlayStation's blocky grey menu being crucial, it was well hidden, perhaps to force people to buy more memory cards. The Dreamcast took its idea to another level. Its own startup screen acted as the system's hub, where owners could manage save files, load games, play music, and adjust system settings such as the inbuilt clock, another first. It was no coincidence that Microsoft's first entrance into the console market, the Xbox, was also the next to use the concept of a pre-game home screen. After all, the company had played a key role in developing Sega's last effort. Number 4. The Dream Eye. After seeing a prototype PS2 at the 99 Game Developers Conference, Richard Marks was struck with an inspiration: a digital camera peripheral which could detect motion, allowing for highly interactive motion-controlled games. What fun that would be, he mused, we assume. Marks subsequently joined Sony to work on his pet project, the iToy. Little did he know, Sega had already beaten him to the punch. Before the iToy was even a twinkle in Mark's eye, Sega's R&D had already conceptualized a virtually identical device, and in 1998 began to develop it proper. Originally devised as the Dreamcast's answer to the booming webcam industry, the Dream Eye began to acquire more lofty intentions. At one point, Sega of Japan's Takanori Fujishima thought that it might be a cool idea for gamers to be able to take pictures of themselves to use as skins, allowing them to play as themselves. As we know, technology did sufficiently advance to allow this. Unfortunately for Sega, their exit from the hardware market had long since been written into video game folklore. Number 3. Voice control. Any Xbox users who have tried and repeatedly failed to perform even the most basic of tasks with just the power of speech can blame the idea on the Dreamcast. Had Sega's cutting-edge console survived its infancy, our frustrations with voice recognition could have occurred much sooner. The Dreamcast's microphone was similar in execution to the N64's voice recognition unit, neatly slotting into the controller's expansion slot. Originally developed for the frankly ludicrous Seaman, which is basically Hey You Pikachu where you look after a monster fish person, the peripheral was set to be used in a whole range of titles, but its potential was cut short by the Dreamcast's early demise. In the end, it was compatible with just 3 published games. Number 2. Motion controls. The overriding theme of this list seems to be that the Dreamcast was a beautiful thing, but it has a lot to answer for. Nintendo's Wii was met with a widespread further hitherto unseen in the industry, but it courted much criticism from the hardcore section of the video game audience who accused the company of betraying their roots by focusing on universally accessible casual titles. Of course, the complaint was utter nonsense. Nintendo had carved out a vaunted reputation as the industry's innovators, and they weren't averse to taking a risk on a potentially divisive product. Unfortunately for the frothing fanboys, their misplaced rage was also misdirected. The motion control gravy train had left the station long before Nintendo devised the Wii. 8 years prior, Sega unleashed just what the gaming world had been waiting for: the Dreamcast fishing controller. As the name suggests, the peripheral was conceived largely with bass bothering in mind, and the console had no shortage of angling action. No fewer than 6 fishing titles called the Dreamcast their home. The applications of the controller were seemingly limited, but it harbored a hidden script: primitive motion sensing capabilities. Aside from being used to fine-tune cast-offs, the secret sensors were also compatible with Soul Calibur's sword swinging, as well as racket swinging in Virtua Tennis, essentially turning the latter into a prototype Wii Sports. Number 1. Online play. The N64 was the first major machine to allow 4 players to compete straight out of the box, but in 1996, anything more than that seemed a long way off. Widespread netplay might as well have been a hover car. Then suddenly the Dreamcast made it a reality. Consoles had been able to connect to the internet before. The NES had its own modem, for goodness sake, but none had ever allowed it on purchase before Sega's beautiful white box. With a modem already in place under the hood, users could hook the Dreamcast up to a phone line and start enjoying the bounteous pleasures of online gaming from day one, provided it was Choo-Choo Rocket. Endearing as Sonic Team's mouse shepherding puzzler was, it wasn't exactly the greatest advert for the exciting possibilities of online multiplayer. Phantasy Star Online, on the other hand, was a game so far ahead of schedule in terms of industry expectations that it was ridiculous. It's impossible to imagine the console scene today without online gaming. It's so ubiquitous that many games have abandoned the tradition of local multiplayer altogether. Apparently, bringing people together means keeping them apart. But in that way, the Dreamcast can claim responsibility for confining a whole generation of gamers firmly in their bedrooms, despite the fact that they were all still playing together. The Dreamcast itself might have been way ahead of its time, but there are plenty of individual games that can also claim that title. Check out this list on screen now to stay with us here at WhatCulture Gaming, and other than that, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment down below on your favourite Dreamcast memories. You can head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. I've been Si for WhatCulture, and have a good week.